So, welcome everybody. This is a panel where we're having a look at the historical experiences and contemporary solutions. We're looking at applying lessons from a wide variety of experience and sectors on this panel to the fight against climate change and other public health campaigns, to the fight against youth digital addiction. And this initiative of human change is an initiative of Margarita Louise-Dreyfus, which helps us bring together a convening and a conversation on some really critical issues. And in this conversation, looking at climate change, it helps us frame one of the number one risks actually at the World Economic Forum and globally in terms of issues of change, which is climate. So I would like to introduce our panelists. On my left is Chris McKenna, founder and CEO of Project Young Eyes. Welcome. Protect Young Eyes, my apologies.
Just one letter. I was going to let it go. Yeah.
Protect Young Eyes.
That's his proofreader.
Yes. Beside him we have Dr. Gaia Bernstein, co-director of the Gibbons Institutes of Law, Technology and Society at Seton Hall University. Beside Gaia, we have Larissa May, founder and executive director of Half the Story. Beside Lars, we have Dr. Stacy Drury, Psychiatrist-in-Chief at Boston. Psychiatrist-in-Chief at Boston Children's. And at the very end, we have Dr. Michael Rich. What do you do? Pediatrician at Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital. So what I love about our panel is we bring from both civil society and the public health sector, law, a group of really experienced individuals to help us think through this complex issue. And I want to start how the idea of human change is similar or akin to climate change. And one of the things that we know about climate change is it's considered a wicked problem. And wicked problems don't have easy solutions. They're kind of a better or worse scenario. They're very difficult to define. They don't have one-shot solutions to them. And this is one of those conversations where it's not easy just to say, as we have talked about on previous panels, just ban a phone or just pick an age and make a determination. So I want to frame this conversation around wicked problems and how when we look at youth digital addiction or problematic interactive media use, what that looks like in relation to climate change. So I'm going to begin, and I'll open it up to any of the panelists to start. What do you see as some of the similarities or differences to climate change with this issue?
Okay. Well, there are a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. In climate change, I think first we think about words, and words matter. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, but the idea of a carbon footprint was actually originally created by PR companies for big oil to take the onus off of those companies and put them on the consumer. We all know that a carbon footprint is not the only way to measure your impact on the climate. Similarly, we have screen time. We've started to look at that as the only metric for how we can gauge our relationship to the internet. We know from this panel and from many of the doctors up here that not all screen time is created equal and that we have to have more nuanced ways of looking at it. I would say one other big difference, and I'd love to hear, Stacy, your perspective on this, is in the smoking movement, there was a huge campaign about secondhand smoke in babies and children. But we have not talked about that as much within the modern conversation and advertising, and I know that babies are your specialty, so perhaps you might have a thing or two to say about that.
Yeah, so I think one of the things with climate change was it started to be about your kids and your grandchildren, right? And that people were like, wait, we have to create a safer world. And then we had kids saying, we have to create a safer world, and going before the UN, right? And one of the challenges with social media and the child mental health crisis is that in order for us to do that, we have to own and acknowledge and talk about child mental illness, right? So no one denied that people smoked. Right, because you saw it. And all of us have smelled like smoke after being around other people who've smelled like smoke. So there was no denying that. People deny mental illness all the time. It is in every family, right? It is in every family. And there are people that say, oh, that's not something I deal with, right? There are people that have the capacity to invest and transform how we build the guardrails to protect kids from social media and protect their child mental health. And they are not coming to the table because they don't want to admit that someone in their family tried to kill themselves. Yeah. That someone in their family has a neurobiologic illness called depression, or that someone in their family has alcoholism. It is in 1 out of every 3 people, which means it's in every family.
And I think this idea of destigmatizing is important, which comes with any campaign, whether it was smoking, even issues of climate change, trying to, look at what the science is around that. In terms of protection, what about protecting young eyes?
Well, I think that to call out some more of the differences between climate change and human change, I was reflecting on this a little bit last night. In my role, I deal a lot one-on-one with families, DMs all week long of moms in crisis, right, dealing with kids in various stages of whatever is going on their screens. This is humans. I mean, right away, when you think about the title of this compared to other issues, humans as opposed to some other issue, I know that there are hundreds, thousands, however many that are impacted by climate change every single day. But when I hear statistics like Stacy saying that she loses 12 children every single day to suicide, like there's just something that really pokes differently about this as an issue. And I was just reflecting last night, why did it take until 2024 for there to be a human change house? I mean, I hope that this starts the fact that next year there are 4 or 5 that you could walk up and down the promenade and see some maybe changing the conversation, because this is humans. I think other differences is that we can't wait 50 years as we did with tobacco or other issues. The speed with which everything is changing means that we must move faster. So I think that's a big difference. Another difference is the complexity of this issue. As I deal with different legislators and others in the states where I'm from, unlike other issues where you maybe had legislators who were in the industry that they were trying to regulate, I think for the first time we have something that none of them understand, or very, very few of them understand. Therefore, I think they struggle to truly grasp the impacts of that. And we could go on and on. I mean, the lobby engine is intense. They also control the narrative. The very organizations that we are trying to change are the ones who control all of the digital spaces where we're trying to have the conversations. I'm not trying to point fingers that they're manipulating the conversation, but there isn't an arm's length sort of transaction there. They are controlling those environments, and those same lobby organizations that are so well funded are using those same digital spaces to weaponize their misinformation against us through SEO and other things. So I just think it's a complex, it's a wicked issue that has a whole other list of complexities that I think just make it more complex to try to solve, maybe compared to other problems.
Gaia, you've done a lot of work on this actually in your writing.
Yeah, I want first of all to add to the topic of climate change and to these important points about similarities and dissimilarities. So I think there are 2 additional similarities. In both cases, who's going to bear the brunt of this? The next generation of climate change and of what's happening with addictive designs, excessive screen time, because the kids are developing now, they're the ones who are the most affected. In addition, there's another similarity, and that's what I call the science wars. So whenever you see an industry that is harming its consumers and the truth starts trickling out, what happens? Well, some scientists try to prove that there's harm, and then the industry starts supporting research proving there's no harm. And we spend sometimes decades arguing the points, and that's exactly what we're seeing now, both with climate change and with the issue of technology addiction. Now, I think there is an important difference also going on here, and this difference is about who is involved. So if we're looking at climate change, we see the kids in the streets. We see the kids demonstrating. We see the kids suing the government, saying, you have stolen our future, we do not see kids in the streets demonstrating against us for turning them into zombies by giving them these technologies.
They're all staring at their phones.
Right.
But are they?
And I think there might be some who are doing more, but the most of them say, we're fine, we don't really want to speak to other people, we're good as we are. And I think for that, this places a much stronger responsibility on us as adults to do something. Now in law we have this term abuse and neglect. It's usually used for an individual child. But you can also think about generational abuse and neglect, because we're basically leaving these kids in front of abusive technologies which are manipulating them. And it's so easy to neglect them. It's so easy to just leave them in the next room next to their screens because it's so hard to tear them apart. And I think we have a very strong responsibility here to do it for them.
I think there's also another thing we didn't talk about, which is what is the connection between the human change issue and the climate change issue? And one of the greatest sources of apathy that we see with the kids that we work with is how social media impacts their feelings or lack thereof about climate change. And the number one thing that I am afraid of is actually apathy for the next generation. And I started half the story as a young person who almost ended my life because of social media. And I'm doing this, and I'm here 9 years later, and I've seen young people all over the world do this too. But they have so many things to be afraid of. They open their phone, they're watching kids across the world that look like them die on a battlefield. They're watching mudslides in the world burning down in a way that no other generation had access to. And so with that, I think we have to think not only about these issues, how they connect, and the other things that our next generation are up against. But I will say that there is hope. There is a groundswell. There are thousands of young people that we get to work with in the United States, lobbying, visiting, that are testifying for bills. And we didn't see that with tobacco. We didn't see kids going up against companies, and they are. And my one job is to make sure that in every room where a decision is being made about them, that there is that voice.
Just before we jump to you, Chris, Dr. Rich, one of the things I know about your work at the Digital Wellness Lab is that you try and be hope-filled. And I think the issue of climate changes is one that in some cases freezes people because they don't see a pathway. And because of that, they freeze. And we know that concern, or identifying even fear cells, that is fairly easy initially to happen. But you need concern to be backed by hope and then action. So do you want to speak a little bit about how we could move in a hope-filled way in relation to this issue?
Sure. Well, folks like Lars are doing just that, which is, seriously, I mean, I think that it's very easy in this kind of a setup or this kind of a situation to sort of say, stop it, block it, don't do it. The problem is that doesn't give them a place to go. Right? It doesn't give them something to do. So at least in our clinical work, we are always leading with alternatives rather than don'ts. I had a 16-year-old patient come into my room one day and sort of flop down in the chair. I said, what's the matter? He said, the whole world is shoulding on me. You should do this. You should not do that. Yeah. And so I learned a lot from him. Right. Yeah. And what he's saying is, I don't feel I have a sense of agency for myself. People are telling me particularly what not to do, but also what to do, and I don't own that. And so, our work is really around not only identifying risks, but also trying not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. They have to be facile, more than facile. They need to be experts with digital interactive media. But how they can self-regulate it. And I think the real problem with the populations that I take care of, which are children and adolescents, is because their prefrontal cortex is still a decade away from being fully developed and their executive function, their impulse control is just not there. We have to scaffold that in some way. Not tell them what to do, not tell them how to drive the car, but put guardrails on the road.
I want to just touch, because you made me think of something really important, and it's power, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so climate change is overwhelming and incapacitating, and kids and youth often feel like there is nothing they can do because they're a child, right? And similarly with social media, there is that powerlessness. Like, I have to be on social media because if I don't, I don't have any connection to my social world, or I won't be connected to whatever. And if we as grown-ups say, you can't have this, we are not empowering them, right? And similarly, I don't know how many of you have children that really, really harped on you to recycle, but I did. And that was because she saw the polar bears and dying and drowning and all of these things. And so for years, we became really good recyclers, except I live in Louisiana where we don't actually recycle, but we looked like we recycled. But she had the power, right? And I was able to hear her. And so part of this is, as we think about it, how do we take the creative genius that is the next generation, and instead of saying that we are going to control or stop, how do we empower them, just like with climate change, to be the drivers of change? Because then they are committed, they're engaged, and they're part of the solution, which they have to be.
And have a sense of agency.
Yeah,
Right.
and going off of that, our children are the greatest agents of change that we have in the digital world. These kids move faster than any single one of us on this panel, and I am constantly, the reason that I have hope is because I get to see the best of these children every day, drafting bills, bringing them to me, going to the Capitol, but not even making change at the top, being the agents of change in their community, and creating policy to say, hey, I won't have screen-free social spaces, and I'm going to nominate 5 of my peers at my school to ensure that every person has a friend to talk to. The children themselves are the only ones that can change this. If we don't have their buy-in, everything that we do means nothing. And I think that that's one of the biggest places, is that we constantly, even here, I wish these kids were here, we talk about them, we talk at them. These kids are my boss. I get on phones with them every single week. Our kids are speaking on a panel together from our teen advisories in 2 weeks with Common Sense Media.
Yeah.
We work for them.
Yeah,
And the should, right? Yeah.
Well, no, I think that there was something really powerful that Dr. Mitch, who's a part of other these panels, talked about. There's another difference that I think points to a huge opportunity when it comes to the digital issue that we're discussing here. This is different than other issues because it hits at a core of who we are as humans. Like, we were designed for connecting with each other, right? We were designed to be in relationship with each other. So just to take it away is to cut off the very thing that they feel internally compelled to do. So when a teen tells you, you take your phone away, it feels like you're chopping their arm off. They're not kidding. You're chopping away a piece of who they are. And so I think to have a conversation with them to explain, this is why you so desire to be on social media, to use that as an opportunity for educating them about who they are, to then show them how some of these companies are manipulating the very thing that they were designed to love and to do, I think empowers them to think of a better way to connect and to make some of those choices for themselves instead of just taking it out of their lives. Because as I remind parents all of the time, Phil, the 14 or 15-year-old version of them, if TikTok existed back in the 80s, or if Snapchat existed, they would be making all of the exact same decisions and choices as their children. In fact, I sometimes joke that some of them would be in prison right now if social media existed, right, if they were children. But I mean, just to make the point that we have to approach them with an abundant amount of empathy, because 14-year-old brains, I mean, aren't radically different than they were back when I was growing up. We still desired connection. We still wanted to find a tribe of humans who we could relate to, who approved of us as we were going through this tough developmental stage. And so I think to bring them into that, to help them feel as though they can design a healthier place to have that connection is very, very powerful.
Connection
I
in
think
an
we
age
need
of-
to do more than help them feel that. We have to hand it over to them.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that we can learn from in terms of previous public health campaigns is tobacco use. For years, decades even, we would have, cut open black lungs in science class or whatever. It didn't work. Scare tactics don't work. Negative stuff doesn't work. When it became stupid to smoke, when kids did things like the Truth Initiative, where they would prank call tobacco executives, and they would, throw body bags down in front of the headquarters where they were active, they were pushing it, and it went from being cool to smoke to being totally uncool and stupid. That's when we turned the corner.
Culture over policy. And Gaia, I know that you've done work in terms of regulatory conversations. What do you know from the legal side of things?
So I spent some time looking into the past to understand what is going on here now. So I looked at the battles against tobacco, and the most important thing that I've noticed that happened there and is happening now, and it happens every time an industry comes out with a harmful product, people realize it's harmful, the first thing they do is put the blame on the consumers. So it's not us, it's you. You are the choice maker. It's your responsibility. So, for example, when smokers and their families sue tobacco companies in courts, and so what happened? They said, well, you chose to smoke. It's your responsibility. And they lost for decades. Tobacco smokers and their families lost cases. Another thing to learn is also where this argument broke, which I think is where we have hope for the future. And one place where it broke was when evidence came out that the tobacco companies were addicting their consumers on purpose. That's when in the 1990s smokers started winning cases. So that's one place. Another place that made a difference is children, and I think that's why I really believe in being here and focusing on children first, even though this is affecting all of us. We're all spending too much time on our technologies. So basically, we can see that much harsher measures were implemented towards preventing kids from smoking. I mean, when I was a kid, my parents would just send me to the grocery store to get them cigarettes. I mean, this cannot happen now. I could never send my kids to get me cigarettes. Things have changed a lot. So taxes also. Cigarettes are so much more expensive than they used to be. Who are the most affected by that? Kids, because they have less money. And the research shows that if kids don't start smoking earlier, they're less likely to become smokers. So I think even though tobacco and cigarettes are so different from technology, because technology has good and has bad, and tobacco is obviously vile, we can learn a lot from it. And another thing I think is important to think about, talking about what I mentioned before, the science wars. So even though there's really no redeeming feature in tobacco, it took years. The first studies about the harms of tobacco came out in the 1950s. But the tobacco industry fought back with its own studies. They came out with filtered cigarettes, which they said were healthy. They managed to get 50% of smokers to use filtered cigarettes, which were just as harmful. And only in 1964, the Surgeon General announced that actually smoking is a health hazard.
And then similar to that, the advertising had to change. Yeah. Because that's one of the other challenges that we see is, with big tech or large platforms, the ability to advertise and directly market to young people. It is different than going to a store. This is one-to-one throughout the day kind of marketing. And that's, when you look at use agreements, you scroll down them, very rarely does anybody ever read, if ever, the larger use agreement. And then the idea of, well, you've signed an agreement, but did you really consent to that? Lars?
Well, I think one of the things that you brought up, since this is the World Economic Forum, is incentives. One thing that we've not spoken about on this panel is that technology and tobacco are also very different. Tobacco is inherently bad for every single person on the planet. Technology is not always a bad thing. In fact, one of the greatest issues that the World Economic Forum is working on this year is digital equity. It's the first thing you see when you drive in. 30% of kids around the world don't have access to internet. So as I sit here, and we're here worried about how do we tackle this? It's not how do we get rid of tech, because it is a social determinant of public health. And what I mean by that is that kids need to know how to use tech in the right way to be able to support them economically, academically, and emotionally. So we could sit here, we could sue every platform in the world, we could lobby against them, all of the things that we've seen in the last 3 years. Who knows what's going to happen with all these attorney generals suing the states, but we still need tech. So how do we also take note from the climate movement and flip the incentive structure and say, hey, tech, we know that we need you to work. We don't need Facebook and we don't need Instagram, but we need email. So how do we incentivize you as a company through tax breaks and take notes from climate change so that we can reinvest in our kids instead of just throwing money down the drain every day, which is really what's happening.
And I'm going to turn to our physicians around nutrition as an issue, moving away from tobacco, and how do we still work with public health campaigns in nutrition, and how could we learn from that in terms of digital addiction and technology?
Okay, no. If you want.
Yeah.
go
So
right
I mean, I think so. I will flip this, right? So think about McDonald's, right? One of the most addictive fast food chains around. And they are the best French fries of the fast foods. I mean, I'm just going to go there. They are, right? Like Burger King, not so much. So my point is that McDonald's came and took over the market, right? And we also put McDonald's-type foods into every school, right? Soda machines in schools. In the U.S. Well, okay, not in Switzerland. Sorry. You guys have chocolate?
Show off.
We're so proud to say we never went to a McDonald's.
Right?
But this is a good point.
Right.
It is an issue of advocacy in some schools and some communities to make sure that those aren't in schools. So continue.
Right, and so as we took McDonald's and we put it in different cultures, we skyrocketed rates of obesity and diabetes, right? So as soon as we took this easy access food, and part of the problem, and this goes to your equity, is that easy access fast food also is dirt cheap and way less expensive than fresh food. And in the United States tends to be in poorer areas or neighborhoods, what we call food deserts, that don't have access to fresh food, right? And you save time, which you don't have because you're working 2 or 3 jobs. And similarly, when we talk about technology, it is really easy for me, well, it was not actually really easy for me, when my children were growing up, to control the time they got their phones, right? And their use of their phones, because I had a husband, because I was economically stable, and because I loved to fight with my daughter, right? But I took that on. I wasn't conflict averse. And so we did have all of those challenges and those battles. And I used to have to go take the phone and put it upstairs, and then when she woke up and got it again, go back and get it, right? But I had the capacity and the time, right? And so as we think about this equity issue, we have to remember that not everybody has that same personal resource to be able to do that. And similarly, fighting McDonald's took having them put the calories on their labels, right? It took having people go through the drive-through and make sure that the calories were on the labels. And it took that guy who ate a lot of McDonald's and got really big, right? It took an impact. It took an impact person and through media, right? So
Which brings us back to this issue of it's a wicked problem that is going to take time, and that kind of collective effort. I also think that we've talked a lot about advertising and the impact of advertising, and this is maybe a different, more intimate form of advertising, because you could drive by a McDonald's, but it wasn't when you wake up, every moment you turn, when you go to bed, right? Michael?
I'm a little concerned about our easy use of the term addictive and addiction here for a couple of reasons. One is it completely takes the agency away from the young person. I can't help it. I'm addicted, right? It's that doing it to me. And I think that helplessness is also hopelessness. You know, why bother? Why act? This is too much to overcome. And I think we can learn another thing from the tobacco wars, which is for decades and decades, ending up with the master settlement agreement, which sent millions of dollars to the states. Some of them actually use it to controlled tobacco, a lot of them used it to fill potholes in the road, right? They diverted the money, essentially. And at the same time as we were helping kids realize that smoking cigarettes was stupid, what were they doing? They developed vaping, right? Vaping is cool. It's an electronic thing. You can do it in the classroom and the teacher won't even know. And they pushed it out as a health use, right? They said this is to help adult smokers stop smoking. Yes, with watermelon and candy, cotton candy flavored vape, you know. So we have to realize that this, like that, is going to be an ongoing work in progress. There's not going to be a solution. We need to keep moving toward a solution.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to add to the McDonald's addiction story. So what happened with McDonald's, actually, there were a group of teens in New York who decided to sue them because they ate every day at McDonald's, they were obese, they developed diabetes, and McDonald's argued, it's your choice to eat at McDonald's, you're responsible. The court accepted the argument, they lost. So again, we're seeing the same argument, this addiction argument coming from the tech industry, and the tech industry is doing exactly the same now. Absolutely. When the Federal Trade Commission was discussing loot boxes, which is an addictive feature in games, the game companies stood up and said, well, the kids are choosing to play, it's their responsibility, or their parents maybe. They did the same thing indirectly. They gave us these tools to use. Like they gave parents controls, they gave us notifications, tools that don't really help, but basically say the same thing, like the tobacco industry said, like the junk food industry said. You are responsible. Look, we're giving you all the tools to fix it. If you're still eating too much, smoking too much, using tech too much, you're responsible.
And now, I was going to say, and now advertising to minors is doing the same by showing them products. I mean, last year in the United States alone, tech made $11 billion off of advertising dollars to minors. Right. So if you're a young girl looking at weight loss or struggling with an eating disorder and all you're getting is weight loss, gym memberships, and all these different things, they're not only profiting off of you, but they're also profiting off of you emotionally. And I think that's the greater opportunity cost, and we haven't really spoken about that here, and I'd be curious to get your perspective, because we know kids are going to go on social media, but how could we think about advertising differently to these kids on these platforms, and do you think that would make much of a change at all?
So I want to actually, because I've never actually thought about this before, but what about also engaging the companies that are advertising? So I was just, like clothing companies that are absolutely making money off of youth, because I will say that I'm not a big social media person because it confuses me, because I didn't have it when I was little. But when I see like a clothing thing come through, I go look, and then all of a sudden I have this at my house, and I'm like, how did that happen? But we haven't engaged in a conversation with the clothing lines, and I'm trying to think of what else, or the gaming companies that are beauty products, right? To say, hey, be our partners with this. We understand this is how you make money. How else can you advertise or get to kids that really are going to be the ones wearing your clothing? Although they should also make them longer too. Like, I don't know why the shirts have gotten shorter and shorter.
I'm unclear. Have you seen those videos where it's like a middle schooler in the 90s dancing in their room, and then a middle schooler in 2024?
Yeah,
They look like they're 20 in a club.
The only saving grace was a high-waisted pants came back
We
and
have
stuff.
to incentivize them.
Yeah.
I mean, they have no incentive to do this. They're not going to do something because it's the right thing to do. We have to make it a business decision for them, how they can have a better business by taking care of their consumers, as opposed to exploiting them.
And maybe we can tax the $11 billion that they earn off kids. Do we do that?
Well, I mean, this is bringing us close to our final piece around what can we do next. So we've identified one of the issues, but I'm going to ask each of you to, and I'll start with you, Chris, in terms of what could this look like in a public health campaign or in an approach, if you could have any resources, any coalitions, any allies, any partners, what would you do to move forward?
Yeah, I heard the phrase yesterday, right? You attract more flies with honey than vinegar. I'm going to admit right out of the gate that I'm a little bit more of a vinegar guy when it comes to this issue. That's right. We'll be the yin and the yang here, and you can have the final word there. And I think it's because I've sat across the table from enough big tech organizations to know that they don't move unless there's a really, really, really compelling reason. And it's always at the last minute. I don't think it's any coincidence that on January 31st, there's a significant hearing that's happening in the United States with CEOs from some of the largest tech organizations finally under subpoena coming together. But last week, we finally have Meta now saying that we are going to remove exploitive content from the feeds of teenagers. Has it ever been a good idea to show self-harm content of 13-year-olds? No, but last week they finally admitted this, right? So that's basically them saying that they've been intentionally harming for 10 years, and it's not until we're being called to task. The same thing happened in 2022 when Mosseri goes to testify. Instagram, as Senator Blackburn said, like a thief in the night before, releases additional controls just ahead of the hearing. So I tend to be a little bit more of a cynic to say that I want to lead with regulatory change. And I don't, right, when you look at the 3 R's, right, you have regulation, reputation, and revenue. Reputation, I think, is one that isn't very effective with them because they control the narrative, right? They make decisions, and even when they're not good, when you go to search for things in Google, they've got their opposition, their spin writers, who have already created enough content that is top ranking. You don't even see what the real story is. I really think, at the end of the day, these are companies that need to make money. Their fiduciary responsibility is to make as much money as possible. I think the combination of looking at ways to leverage regulation to maybe potentially impact revenue is the way to get to them, right? In other words, if you're going to, I think you really need to make it hurt financially to harm children in order to change their habits.
So regulatory structure as a beginning within that.
Yeah, and I think we even have an example of that. If you go back to 2018, iPhones had already existed for 9 years. The parental controls on iPhones were horrible. What happened in 2018 was the California Teachers Pension, which owned a significant amount of Apple stock. They wrote a letter as shareholders of Apple to the board and said, we want you to make, you should read this letter, it's brilliant, that unless you make certain changes, we're going to make certain different financial decisions. And you know what happened in September when they released iOS 12, as they do with the new iOS every year? You had screen time, all of these new parental controls. Now, they're still horrible and not very intuitive, but it was at least, I think, a glimmer to say, wait a minute, as soon as you spoke to them, in a fiduciary way that you were going to impact their revenue if you weren't harming or doing a better job of preventing the harm, I think it showed maybe a path forward that isn't leveraged enough, the power of those shareholders.
Thank you. Gaia.
I agree very much with Chris, and my study of history of the fights against tobacco, against junk food, the battles which are still going on against privacy, shows that one route will not help. You have to do them all at the same time. You have to regulate in order to exert pressure to eliminate addictive features and to exert pressure to change the business model. You have to have class actions, even if they fail one after the other. Right. At the end, the costs are too high. Again, this business model becomes less lucrative. You do need to raise awareness through advertising, which has to be blunt and clear. Research shows that's why we have cigarette packs, which says cancer kills on half the pack. So when you do this in a digital world, it's going to look different, but you'll have to have pop-ups which are very clear, stating all the actual dangers of being online. You need to have prohibitions on advertising of addictive games or other networks to kids. You need to have influencers, the ones that kids listen to, promoting these themes, and you need to get antitrust action.
So a whole constellation of
It's a whole
movements,
constellation, and I think we are moving towards that, but there's not one thing that's going to solve this.
That's the wicked problem, and that's why human change comes together. Lars.
We need international, national consensus. We can't be passing one bill in California and not across the U.S. The second thing we need to do is, I believe, also flip the incentive structure. Politicians are also in bed with the big tech companies. They're getting dollars for their campaigns. So how can we try something new and take note from the climate movement? And third, how do we also incentivize by increasing algorithmic agency on the platform so that we can support the emotional health or shut off these different types of advertisements or even reset the things we see because we're emotionally unwell?
Or be aware of algorithmic bias
Yeah.
to get to algorithmic agency as well, or data bias.
Yeah. Or just create a button and allow people to reset, because the only time they ask you your interests is the moment you log onto the platform.
Yeah, thank you. Stacy.
So I'm going to go with the kid version. I want a bunch of kids posting on their social media that you're basically child labor working for free for these companies. I would love to have a campaign that we do, and we put these commercials in every major sporting event, in every concert that is on TV that they watch. So let's get our musicians to allow commercials, because you can't do it through Netflix because there are no commercials in Netflix, right? But like on Prime TV that kids watch. So concerts, sporting events, I don't know what else I'm missing. But let's put kids sending this message saying, you need to have your data under control. These are the ways to do this. That's what I would like.
Which goes back to, Lars, the national, international, that would cross borders, right? Michael.
So I'm going to jump a little bit into the cynic camp by jumping your cynicism, Chris, in the sense that I was the one who delivered that message from CalSTRS to Apple, sitting around a table, that started the screen time. Here's the problem with screen time. Not just that it doesn't work, but it presumes that the person using it is using it to control their screen time. Yeah. We've had groups of kids who used it to compete to who could get the highest. No, absolutely, right? So it not only dumped it in the laps of the users, the consumers, et cetera, but it was a smokescreen to cover Apple, really. Yeah. And I come down to the fact that words matter. Words matter a lot. And one of the things that I've been saying to Apple and others is, stop talking about parental controls. Right. There's no kid on the face of the earth who wants to be controlled by their parent. Let's talk about parental engagement tools. Let's bring the parents into the dialogue. Let them hear from the kids. Let them learn with the kids. But words really matter, and so just the word control is off-putting to people.
What I find really important about that is having words and language that's shared, because if you change, once culture shifts when people have shared language, and I think that's also really key, that we're able to have a shared language around this issue.
And on the basis of that, or building on that, we haven't talked about that yet this week, but back in June at Cannes, we announced the Inspired Internet Pledge, which is a way to push back to the company and say, do you want to sign on to tune your product for emotional wellness, to listen to those who have been harmed, and act on what you hear. And perhaps most discomforting for the companies, share your data. Not your proprietary business data, but your data on how you're helping your consumers be well. What's working, but also what's not working. So as an industry, they can move towards something better. And surprisingly enough, a number of companies have already signed on to this, despite their legal departments, I'm sure, right? Sure. Because what we say is, look, this is not binding. This is not legally binding. This is aspirational. Do you want to aspire to better, right?
And I think, the one area that I come from, the education sector, in terms of the regulatory, civil society actions, public health campaign movement, would all be very much supported in schools. teachers would see this as something that they would quickly get on board with in both a positive way in terms of strengths and a strength-based approach working with youth and agency, but also in terms of helping to raise awareness and change that language, that overall discourse. So I'm going to jump to questions because we have a few minutes, if you want, from our expert panel to ask questions around what we might do similar to public health campaigns. I'll let you just use that mic.
One of the biggest public health campaigns in recent memory is COVID, of course. And when we had COVID, we saw the world taking very rapid action. You know, airplanes grounded, schools closed, a lot of industries impacted that have very strong lobbies. A lot of politicians who are being funded by those industries had to make decisions that were not benefiting their funders. Why are we not seeing similar action with this campaign? There's so much impact. We have so much research on the negative impact on children. We have children dying every single day because of this. Why are we not seeing action?
Because it's kids. Period. Because it's not grown-ups dying. It's kids. And because it's stigma. And because we don't want to take away our own access. And I think that's a huge component to it. And COVID didn't go beautifully, right? And COVID also created huge disparities in how the message got out. And I will say, we should blame tech for that, right? So that the misinformation that was out and covered extensively. But part of the reason is that as long as we pretend that kids are not the next generation of the workforce, and because they don't vote and because they don't put money into the regulatory bodies in the government, they are second-class citizens, and this is not a grown-up problem.
Another reason is that lots of regulatory bodies do not want to act until they're 100% sure that there is some kind of causation. Now, the tech industry is doing everything in their power to say there's no conclusive evidence. So while some people are trying to say there's lots of urgency, the sense of urgency is not felt as strongly as it should be, like obviously it was with COVID.
Yeah, and I think because, sorry, I'll just add one thing real quick and jump right in. But I think because the language that we've talked about, that this is a health issue, and I think we need to be saying that more often, right? That why aren't there clinics on every corner, right, that are helping children with these issues? Why aren't we educating? I heard the toothbrush, analogy where you were taking the pills to see where there was red because you hadn't brushed in the right spot when you were in kindergarten. I remember this vividly. And I was even thinking to myself, you may hate this as an educator and you can punch me later, but I was thinking to myself, what would be today more useful to me as an adult if I were a 14-year-old today? Algebra or being taught digital resilience, right? And I'm not saying it's neither or, it's probably both, but I think that we need to prioritize this in the same way that we do all other things that we know are critical to the development of young humans. And we just haven't elevated it globally to that level yet. So,
yeah. I wanted to jump on a word that Gaia brought in, which is causation. Here's the truth. We still haven't proven causation between tobacco and lung cancer, right? We have correlations, we have tons of it. We should not be talking about causation so much as relative risk, right? We know that the relative risk of a smoker for lung cancer is huge compared to a non-smoker. But we haven't proven that cigarettes cause cancer. I think we should move away from the term causation because I think it will always be retreating, right? It will always be not be there, but we have to look at the landscape. As parents, as humans, we make hundreds of risk-benefit analyses every day. What's my risk? What is the potential benefit of whatever?
Relative risk over causation.
Turning left off the street, right? Something like that. So I think that we have to take a step back and say, what kind of world do we want to live in, both in terms of risks to me and my loved ones, but also to society. And let's not chase that red herring of causation, because they'll always hide behind it.
We're going to take one more question.
I want to thank you for what you do, because I think it's essential. And being a president of a university, I see that in our classrooms, right? And the effects. And maybe just a point on your question. In Switzerland, and I think it's very similar to US, we have a very profound democracy. And people say, we never, ever want to see this again, where we have an emergency state and the state saying to the different communes and villages what we should do. So there is a resistance to have these kind of measures. Now, I agree with you. When I was a kid, I was a bit astonished by one of your statements. Okay. You said, no parents control. I was addicted to books when I was a kid. I was reading all the time.
Now you're the president of a university.
So let's talk about correlation.
And my father forced me to go out to play soccer. You know, and I love soccer now. So, but you know, so I think the parents have a very, very important role, and also to force the kids. Apparently now it's not allowed anymore. You know, and it's interesting, and something has changed fundamentally. And maybe when you were talking, I was thinking there is a similarity with in France. I was shocked when I heard that the first generation of kids have never seen their parents working. Unemployment is so high. And so working on the parents is as essential, because I'm sure
I'm not arguing we shouldn't work on
they
the
are
parents.
Addicted parents all over the place, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, I wrote, you know, the most addicted, digital addicted people I know are the politicians.
Oh yeah, because they manipulate.
And you have a beautiful one in US, right? Leading the way, right? And so
Maybe I can move to Switzerland.
Excuse me?
Can I move to Switzerland?
So
Just don't go home.
So the question is, I'm not too optimistic that the politics will make it, will understand what it's ongoing, because they are themselves completely in the game, and they're a bit of autists. That's
Right.
why
I want to clarify something. I wasn't arguing about pushing parents out of the paradigm. I was saying keep them engaged, get them engaged, because I think the problem is not that they're not controlling. The problem is that they're not paying attention.
Well,
They're handing, tablets to babies.
It's more
to calm them
convenient.
down.
It's more convenient.
It's way more convenient, exactly. But I think we need to bring them in where they are engaged to the point of actually doing something, as opposed to saying, oh, well, there's screen time on my kid's phone, my kid's fine, right?
I remember this movie where you had a baby going to a TV and trying to push the buttons, right? That was a bit shocking. Maybe just two remarks. One on complexity that was mentioned by you several times. You know, there are studies showing that at a certain level of complexity, a system collapses. An entire civilization, the Roman civilization, collapsed. Are we at this state? That's a question I'm asking my scientists.
An existential question.
You know, I think we are not far from a total collapse of the entire system at the different scales, nations, maybe families, and so on. And the other thing that I didn't hear, and that's worrying me since 10 years already, but when I bring this point, I'm saying, you don't understand nothing, you are just too old for that, is what is the effect of this digital addiction to the creativity of our kids? If you are looking for solutions all the time, I mean, I have two boys, right? And it's interesting. Same medication, completely different result. One is addicted, the other one not at all. But they spend, I think, the same time on, but you feel the dependency is not the same too. So if you look for solution on the internet, how can you solve the next big problem like climate change if you are not able to find your own way and solution?
So
that's
I'm
a
just
big question for me.
So we won't take the existential societal collapse, given the scope of it. But Lars, I'm just going to get you maybe on the creativity piece And then Chris, you might want to respond, and then we'll go to we have one more question at the very end. So go ahead.
Well, I love that you brought that question up, because what I say to parents today is that kids aren't kids in the world that we live in. They are put behind these screens and have immense pressure. If they mess up, the whole world sees it. And I didn't grow up that way, and I'm sure you didn't grow up that way. And so in a lot of our education programs, it is actually around digital resilience in this new world, so both digital resilience and emotional resilience, but it's actually rooted in play and creativity, not fear at all. And what we find is that if we allow kids to come up with ways where they can unhack their technology and actually make it playful and creative, and to get them into that headspace, one, it's actually a huge challenge to get them out of being, just a robot, of being on their tech and doing their thing. But two, being in a space of play and creativity actually helps nurture who we are as humans, which cultivates real human connection. And I think it's a huge problem. A lot of arts programs are getting cut. We are focusing more on the tech than what the opportunity cost is, and it's that these kids don't have connection, and it really starts with themselves. So I'm team creativity and play.
Bring back recess.
Screen-free recess.
Screen-free recess, right? Bring back recess. Let recess, going outside to play during school days. Bring back that. It is not in schools anymore, and it's not in schools even for the littlest ones. And part of that is, we thought they had to learn so much information. Kids learn by movement. Kids learn by running, by physical manipulation. And so for the younger kids, the creativity is actually built in those earlier phases. We don't want hardcore locked-in attentional mechanisms in place until you are much older, because we need you to be physically moving to build your strength in space.
Well,
in the U.S.
No.
in
No.
the United States,
It's being cut back a lot.
Overwhelmed.
a compression in curriculum where that's, especially literacy and numeracy, has taken over some of that space. But it's not
Yeah, we all did,
international.
right?
Yeah.
It's not an international issue because Finland has real emphasis on play. Canada is
Switzerland,
play
all
based.
over the place. We sent them
And
to
Switzerland. So
Florida.
there are countries where I think that space is created.
And it would be great to have the data to look at that, like how much play time in your academic world. But even on a college campus, right? Like, how do we make sure that we are building in those physical, movement and activities and going from space to space and, working to make that screen-free time?
I took a photo in the other room where we were gathering people. 74% of students spend less time outside than prisoners.
Yeah, right. That's pretty.
Get them outside and lock the door.
I've got another. I think one more.
So just one suggestion. Hi, I'm Harold Koplowitz. I'm a child psychiatrist. We have some data that shows that certain kids are more at risk for dependence than everyone else. And I think that when we're more careful, where we're saying it's not poison for everyone, whether or not we think that spending so much time on a screen will mean less time in real life interactions, less sleep. There's lots of things that screen time take away from. But most specifically, girls who have internalizing disorders are more at risk for problematic internet usage. And we also know that kids with mental health disorders are more at risk for extra symptoms, particularly if you have ADHD or depression, if you do 6 to 8 hours or more of internet every day. So I think there's a way, when you were saying you have 2 kids, they come out differently. Well, DNA roulette, every time we make a baby. But I think it's helpful if we're tackling this as a health issue, and we don't want we don't want the tech companies to squash it, to say, let's just be careful about kids who have anxiety disorders. The most common mental health disorder among all the mental health disorders for kids. And just to remind you, mental health disorders are the most common disorders of all of childhood, much more common than infectious disease. So that if we're protecting kids, certainly the most vulnerable, I think that's a good approach to start. And then if you're a parent, you think, well, why am I only doing it for my anxious kid? I think we should be more careful in monitoring what my other kids are watching too.
I think there's also a large population of kids that don't have engaged caregivers, and we leave them out of this conversation. The majority of the kids that we work with in rural and urban under-resourced places have parents that can't show up to parent nights because
Right.
they're working multiple jobs. The iPad is the babysitter. And so I think it's especially important in these scenarios that we are not talking about the upper 5-10%. We have to be looking at the 90% of the world that is impacted by this.
And the neglect that
Yeah.
results.
Yeah.
So I'm going to finish off with Michael, but just in terms of that point, when you have limited resources, being able to focus, that's important, but also the age is a very interesting conversation that we've been having here. We know in education systems that 11 to 14 is when we see that more independent use of technology. It's when, young people are kind of let loose a bit more. And so we do a lot of digital wellness, digital literacy support in that particular age group. So it's both the areas of focus, ADHD, you mentioned, some of the anxiety, mental health. Yeah, and similarly, we will probably on future panels have another conversation about those age thresholds. So Michael, I'll let you finish off with this and then I'll thank everybody.
I have a final bring back.
Oh, no.
We have to bring back boredom. We cannot get on an elevator. Boredom, right. We can't get on an elevator or in a bus without looking at our devices. I came out of the hospital a few months ago, end of a long day, walked toward my car in the parking garage. I was walking west. There was a glorious sunset, and everyone on the street was doing this.
Missing it.
Nobody saw it except me.
Wow.
It completely charged me after a rough day.
Watching the sunset on the screen.
Maybe, yeah. Take a picture of it. Take a picture of it. No, but I want to recall that a little over a century ago in this very country, there was a lowly patent clerk who spent his days stamping meaningless bureaucratic papers and then went upstairs at the end of the day and ended up in the space of 1 year writing the 4 key papers of theoretical physics.
Einstein.
Exactly.
Burn.
Late,
Late.
yeah, right. But yeah, thank you for your service. Right. But when late in his life, after a whole generation of physicists had tried to prove all of these theories wrong, and they were resistant to being proved wrong, he was asked, "How did you do this?" And he said, "Because I was bored. Because my mind could travel. Because I could think about, well, maybe time and space are a continuum. Maybe they bend." And what really stuck with me is that boredom is where creativity happens. Not just because we're not filling our head with other people's ideas and images and stuff.
You know where he got his idea for the relativity? At the train station, looking at this famous Swiss train station clocks. And he was looking at two, and he was imagining his waving between the two, and then came. Wow.
Yeah.
So I think
but no,
Just watch
I think we have to recognize the value of boredom is not just the empty space, but the fact that it's a little uncomfortable. So we have to fill that empty space with something. We don't give ourselves that empty space anymore.
Adults or children.
Absolutely.
So on that note, I think that the panel, the distinguished panel, has given us not only a framing of the issues, but also really clear approaches and solutions that have potential to work based on public health campaigns, but also something that would be iteratively changed and bringing together parents, bringing together youth, bringing together expertise we could develop over time. So if people say there is no approach to this wicked problem, we actually have a constellation of approaches. So on behalf of the Human Change Project, I want to thank all of our panelists, and we'll carry on the conversation. Thank you.